On the 17th of December 1948, Israel officially applied to join the United Nations in what was its second attempt to be admitted into the global governing body within the same year. To be approved, Israel needed several countries on the Security Council to vote in its favour. Tel Aviv's bid was rejected, with only 5 voting for admission, 1 opposing and 5 abstaining. Syria was the only country to vote against, while Britain, Canada and France were among those who abstained. Gaining international recognition and legitimacy was vital for the new state. The international body was unhappy with Israel's violations of resolutions 181 and 194. 181 was the UN's approved partition plan, which envisaged 2 states within certain boundaries, one Jewish one and another Palestinian. However, in the 1948 war, known in Arabic as the Nakba, saw Israel expanding its territory beyond what was allotted to them in the resolution. Resolution 194 included the provision for the return of 700,000 Palestinian refugees who were expelled by Zionist militias that went on to form the Israeli army. Implementing these resolutions was a precondition, and in 1949 Israel pledged to uphold these plans. 100,000 Palestinians found themselves inside the borders of the newly created Israeli state, and Tel Aviv decided to grant them citizenship as part of its attempt to be accepted into the UN. These promises were enough for Israel's membership to be approved. Despite being given citizenship, Palestinians did not have equal rights with Israeli Jews. Tel Aviv placed them under martial law. Between 1949 to 1966, the way Palestinian lives were governed served as a model Israel would later use after the 1967 war, when it would seize and occupy East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Syrian Golan Heights, and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. While Israel's occupation of these territories continues to make headlines today, less attention is given to Israel's Palestinian citizens, known as 48 Palestinians. 48ers or Arab Israeli, and many are unaware Israel's occupation began before the 1967 war.
It was a modern-day religious war, a blood feud that raged out of control.
The 1948 Nakba, which saw 80% of Palestinians expelled from their homes, radically transformed the Middle East. Palestinians who remained within the borders of the new state found themselves transformed from living as Arabs in Palestine into a Palestinian minority within Israel. The Palestinian minority from the period can be divided into 2 groups: those who remained in their homes and those who were displaced from their homes but remained within Israel. The displaced were classed as present absentees by Tel Aviv and were often refused the right to return to their properties or to reclaim them. Being a citizen of Israel did not protect Palestinians from expulsion from their homes after the 1948 war. Yehusha Palmon, born in Palestine to Russian Jewish settlers who spoke Arabic and served in the Haganah's Arabic section, was one of the key advisors to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion on Arab affairs. Palmon regarded the Palestinians in Israel as a threat and pushed for hawkish policies against them. In 1949, he arranged for the expulsion of Palestinians from Majdal, despite being citizens, to make way for the Israeli city of Ashkelon. They were deported to Gaza, and it was only in 1958 that Israel adopted a policy against the population transfer of Palestinians. The threat of deportation was routinely made by Israeli leadership. Palestinian villages near the Syrian or West Bank border were frequently threatened with expulsion. Some were in fact expelled. While some Israeli politicians felt it was unnecessary to be so harsh on the Palestinian minority, others wanted to go much further. Ben-Gurion believed they posed a threat to the Jewish identity of the state, and military rule was the best solution. He contemplated ramping up expulsions or forcefully converting them to Judaism. Tel Aviv developed a system of military rule to govern the lives of Palestinians, while Jewish citizens enjoyed full democratic rights. The military rule was based on the British Mandate's emergency regulations, and it entailed regional army commanders supervising governors of Palestinian communities. The commanders had executive, legislative and judicial powers over the minority population. According to historian Ilan Pape, the military rule can be divided up into two periods, 1948 to 1957 and 1957 to 1966. The first period can be characterized as Israel's attempts to downsize the Palestinian population. The second period saw a softening of these positions and more emphasis on managing the population. In towns and cities, military rule was felt indirectly, as civilian authorities were used to control the population, while rural areas were directly controlled by the army. Palestinian freedom of movement was restricted. Palestinians needed permission to travel to another place outside of their area. Administrative detention or arrest without charge was routinely used. Curfews were sometimes imposed. Checkpoints were set up on entrance to villages, and, similar to the situation in the West Bank today, people could be made to wait in long lines and prevented from getting to work or nearby hospitals. The first period was brought to an end by the Kafr Qasim massacre. Kafr Qasim, a Palestinian hilltop town near Tel Aviv, was a concern for Israeli commanders as they feared the local population might cause trouble during a war. Israel, alongside Britain and France, was preparing to invade Egypt and seize Suez in 1956. On the 29th of October, Colonel Ishakar Shadami was given permission to impose a curfew at 5 p.m. on Kafr Qasim. The issue was, the curfew initially announced by Israel was to begin at 9 p.m, and locals were unaware of this change. Soldiers were told to shoot on sight without warning if anyone broke the curfew. A few minutes before 5 p.m, two Palestinians, Ahmed Farik and Ali Taha, got off their bicycle and approached the Israeli soldiers at the checkpoint. The officers on the checkpoint jokingly asked the two men if they were happy, and when they replied yes, he ordered them to stand still. The soldiers then opened fire and Farik and Taha were killed. Other Palestinians met a similar fate. Fatima Sassour, who was 8 months pregnant and had been out picking olives, met the same fate. Shooting continued for 1 hour and 48 Palestinians were killed. It took Israel 2 weeks to acknowledge the massacre. It initially blamed Palestinian fighters who it claimed had snuck into Israel. The town was closed to outsiders for 3 weeks, and it was only when communist members of the Knesset managed to get into Kafr Qasim to collect evidence that public pressure mounted and a commission was set up. It found that soldiers should be prosecuted, and the victims were offered 1,000 Israeli pounds in compensation. The soldiers were never punished, but those who opposed military rule in the Israeli parliament became more influential. The following year, 1957, saw the first national demonstration by Palestinians joined by Jewish activists against military rule. Pressure forced Israel to change its policies. Palestinians would see improvements in their living standards, more wealth, investment in their communities, and privileges bestowed upon notables. However, in exchange, they were expected to commemorate Jewish national and religious holidays, go out of their way to host government officials, and work closely with the Israeli Secret Service. Palestinian leaders who accepted collaboration with Israel found they were ostracized by their own communities, and this reduced the effectiveness of the new policy. Activism and identification with Palestinian nationalism increased, something Israel hoped to crush. Military rule officially came to an end in 1966. While Palestinians continued to live under restrictions, they could vote and stand in Knesset elections, particularly through the Communist Party. The Communists were non-Zionists and anti-military rule. They were important in voicing opposition to Tel Aviv's policies. Opposition to military rule spread across to different parties, including the political right, when it became clear that Ben-Gurion was using military rule to hang on to power. He would restrict the movement of Palestinians to prevent demonstrations and impose policies upon them, but he would also use threats to encourage them to vote in favour of his party and policies. The fall of Ben-Gurion would lead to the fall of military rule. However, discrimination against Palestinians with Israeli citizenship persists until today, which is best exemplified by Israel's nation-state law, which explicitly states national rights in Israel belong only to Jewish people. The history of military rule is not widely known today, but its impact is still felt, perhaps most notably in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, where a similar model continues to be in operation. Before 1967, 48ers were isolated from both Palestinians and the wider Arab world. In 1967, they have become very closely connected to it and have made enormous contribution to the Palestinian struggle.